September 15, 1983. Fred Rogers arrived at WQED Studios in Pittsburgh at 6 a.m., just like he did every day. But today was different. Today there was a picket line in front of the building. 40 members of the WQED technical staff, cameramen, sound engineers, lighting technicians, editors, were on strike. They'd been working without a contract for 8 months. Management had refused to negotiate fair wages. The workers had no choice but to strike. And now they were standing in front of the building holding signs. Fair wages for WQED workers. We make your shows possible. Respect the crew. Fred pulled his car into the parking lot and sat there for a moment, staring at the picket line. He had a choice to make. He could cross the picket line, go to work, film his show, keep everything running smoothly. That's what management expected. That's what his contract required. Or he could do something else. Something that would shut down his show, cost him his salary, put him at odds with the network, and potentially destroy his relationship with WQED forever. Fred Rogers made his choice. He got out of his car, and he walked toward the picket line. But he didn't cross it. He joined it. 8 months earlier, January 1983. To understand what Fred did that day, you need to understand what led to the strike. In January 1983, the Technical Workers Union contract at WQED expired. The workers, camera operators, sound engineers, lighting technicians, editors, stage crew, had been asking for a modest raise. 3% to keep up with inflation. WQED management said no. The station was struggling financially. PBS funding was tight. Donations were down. They couldn't afford raises. The union countered, "We're not asking for luxury. We're asking to keep up with the cost of living. Our wages have been frozen for 3 years. We're falling behind. Management, we understand. But we don't have the money. If you strike, you'll only hurt yourselves. And you'll hurt the shows." For 8 months they negotiated. Back and forth. The union made concessions. Management refused to budge. Finally, in September, the union had no choice. They voted to strike. 40 technical workers walked out. Without them, WQED couldn't produce shows. No camera operators meant no filming. No sound engineers meant no audio. No lighting technicians meant no proper lighting. The station ground to a halt. Management's response was immediate: "We'll hire replacement workers. Scabs. The shows will continue." The union workers were devastated. "You're going to replace us? After we've worked here for years? After we've made your shows possible?" "Business is business," management said. Fred Rogers heard about the strike the night before it began. His producer, Margie Whitmer, called him at home. "Fred, there's going to be a strike tomorrow. The technical staff is walking out." "Why?" "They haven't had a raise in 3 years. They're asking for 3% to keep up with inflation. Management won't negotiate." Fred was quiet for a long moment. "What does management want me to do?" "They want you to come to work. Cross the picket line. Keep filming. They're hiring replacement workers." "Scabs." "Yes." Fred was silent again. Then he said, "I need to think about this." He hung up and sat in his living room for hours, staring out the window. Joanne found him there at midnight. "Fred, what's wrong?" "There's a strike tomorrow. The crew. The people I work with every day. They're striking for fair wages." "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Management expects me to cross the picket line. Keep working." "But Joanne, these are the people who make the show possible. The camera operators who filmed me for 10 years. The sound engineers who make sure children can hear the music. The lighting technicians who make the neighborhood look warm and safe. They're not asking for much. Just enough to live on. And management is saying no." "What does your contract say?" "My contract says I have to work. If I don't, I'm in breach. They could sue me. They could cancel the show." "But what does your conscience say?" Fred looked at her. "My conscience says I can't cross a picket line. I can't walk past people who are fighting for dignity and pretend everything is fine. I can't use scab labor to make a show about caring for people." "Then you know what you have to do." "It might cost me everything." "Then it costs you everything." September 15, 1983. 6 a.m. Fred got out of his car and walked toward the picket line. The striking workers saw him coming. They went quiet. They knew Fred. They'd worked with him for years. He was always kind. Always respectful. Always said please and thank you. But they also knew he was management. He was the star. The face of the show. The one the network cared about. If Fred crossed the picket line, their strike was over. The show would continue. Management would win. One of the workers, a camera operator named Tom, stepped forward. "Morning, Fred." "Morning, Tom. You here to cross?" Fred shook his head. "No. I'm here to join you." Tom stared at him. "What?" "I'm not crossing the picket line. I'm joining the strike." The other workers couldn't believe what they were hearing. "Fred, you don't have to do this," another worker said. "You're not in our union. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Fred said quietly. "You make my show possible. You've worked with me for years. If you're not being treated fairly, then I can't in good conscience keep working." Tom's eyes filled with tears. "Fred, if you do this, they'll fire you. They'll cancel the show." "Maybe. But I can't cross this line. I can't pretend I don't see what's happening." Fred picked up a sign that was leaning against the building, "Fair wages for KED workers." And he stood with them. Within an hour, word had spread throughout WQED. Fred Rogers is on the picket line. The station manager, a man named Gerald Morrison, came outside immediately. "Fred, what are you doing?" "I'm standing with the workers." "You can't do that. You have a contract. You're required to work." "I'm not crossing a picket line, Gerald." "Fred, these people are being unreasonable. We can't afford their demands. If we give in, it'll bankrupt the station. They're asking for 3% to keep up with inflation. That's not unreasonable. That's just fair. We don't have the money." "Then find it. Because I'm not going to make a show about treating people with dignity while the people who make that show possible are being treated like they don't matter." Gerald's face went red. "Fred, if you don't come inside and work, you're in breach of contract. We can sue you. We can cancel Mr. Rogers' neighborhood permanently." Fred looked at him calmly. "Then you'll have to do what you have to do. But I'm staying here." Gerald stormed back inside. The strike continued. Days turned into weeks. Fred showed up every morning at 6 a.m. and stood on the picket line until 6 p.m. 12 hours a day. 5 days a week. In the rain. In the heat. In the cold. He didn't give speeches. He didn't make grand statements. He just stood there. With the workers. Holding a sign. The media picked up the story almost immediately. Mr. Rogers joins strike. Children's TV host walks picket line. Fred Rogers refuses to work during WQED strike. Reporters swarmed him. "Mr. Rogers, why are you doing this?" "Because it's the right thing to do." "But you're not in their union. This isn't your fight. If people I work with are being treated unfairly, it is my fight." "Aren't you worried about your show?" "I'm more worried about the people who make my show possible. WQED says you're in breach of contract. They could sue you. Then they can sue me." The reporters didn't know what to make of him. This wasn't the typical labor dispute story. This was Mr. Rogers, beloved children's TV host, standing on a picket line in the rain, refusing to back down. It became national news. Inside WQED, management was panicking. They'd hired replacement workers, scabs, to keep other shows running. But they couldn't replace Fred Rogers. There was no substitute Mr. Rogers. The show was Fred. Without him there was no show. And Fred was standing outside with a picket sign. Gerald Morrison called an emergency board meeting. "We need to resolve this. Fred Rogers is making us look like villains." One board member said, "We should sue him for breach of contract. Make an example of him." Another said, "Are you insane? If we sue Mr. Rogers, we'll be crucified in the press. We'll lose every donor we have. Then what do? We settle with the union. Give them what they're asking for. We can't afford it. We can't afford not to. Fred Rogers is standing on our doorstep telling the world we don't treat workers fairly. Every day this continues, we lose credibility. We lose donors. We lose everything." Gerald was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll talk to the union." On October 2, 1983, 17 days after the strike began, WQED management and the union reached an agreement. The workers got their 3% raise. They got better benefits. They got a guarantee that management would negotiate in good faith in the future. The strike was over. The workers had won. And Fred Rogers had been with them every single day. On the morning of October 3rd, Fred arrived at WQED to go back to work. The crew was already there, setting up for the first day of filming after the strike. When Fred walked in, they stopped what they were doing. Tom, the camera operator, walked up to Fred. "Fred, I don't know what to say. You didn't have to do what you did. You risked everything for us." Fred shook his head. "I didn't risk everything. I just refused to pretend I didn't see what was happening. You stood with us. For 17 days. In the rain. In the heat. You could have stayed home. But you showed up every day. Because you mattered. You've always mattered. Tom's voice cracked. We won because of you. If you hadn't joined us, management would have ignored us. But once you stood with us, they had no choice. You won because you stood up for yourselves. I just stood with you. The other crew members gathered around. One of them said, Fred, we want you to know, we'll never forget this. You showed us what solidarity looks like. What it means to actually care about people, not just say you care. Fred looked around at all of them. You make the show possible. You always have. And you deserve to be treated with dignity. That's not radical. That's just basic human decency. They went back to work. But something had changed. The relationship between Fred and the crew was different now. Deeper. More real. Because they'd been through something together. They'd stood together. They'd fought together. And they'd won together. The media coverage continued for weeks. Some praised Fred. Mr. Rogers shows what solidarity means. Others criticized him. TV host puts politics over children. Fred ignored both. He didn't do it for praise. He didn't do it to make a political statement. He did it because he couldn't do anything else. Years later, in 1999, Fred was asked about the strike. Why did you join the picket line? You weren't in their union. You didn't have to. Fred thought for a moment. I've spent my entire career talking about treating people with kindness and dignity. How could I cross a picket line? How could I walk past people fighting for fair wages and pretend I didn't see them? Everything I say on the show would have been a lie if I'd done that. But you risked your show. Your career. My show is about caring for people. If I'd crossed that picket line, the show would have been over anyway. Not literally, but spiritually. Because I would have betrayed everything it stands for. Do you think you made a difference? I don't know. I hope so. But that's not why I did it. I did it because it was right. Because those workers deserved someone in their corner. Because you can't claim to care about people and then ignore them when they need you. The legacy. The 1983 WQED strike is now part of labor history in Pittsburgh. It's studied in union organizing classes, in labor law courses, in ethics seminars. Because Fred Rogers, a children's television host, showed what solidarity looks like. Not in theory. Not in words. In action. He stood on a picket line for 17 days. In the rain. In the heat. He risked his show. His career. His relationship with the network. And he never wavered. Tom, the camera operator, worked with Fred for another 20 years until Fred retired in 2001. At Fred's retirement party, Tom gave a speech. I've worked in television for 40 years. I've worked with a lot of people. Some of them were talented. Some of them were nice. But Fred Rogers is the only person I've ever known who lived exactly the way he told others to live. In 1983, when we were on strike, Fred could have crossed the picket line. Everyone would have understood. He had a contract. He had obligations. He could have said, "This isn't my fight." But he didn't. He stood with us. For 17 days. Not for the cameras. Not for the publicity. He stood with us because he believed we mattered. That's the difference between someone who talks about caring and someone who actually cares. Fred Rogers actually cares. The room gave Fred a standing ovation. Fred, embarrassed by the praise, said quietly, "I just did what anyone should do. I stood with people who needed someone to stand with them. That's not heroic. That's just being human." Epilogue. February 27, 2003. Fred Rogers died on February 27, 2003. His funeral was packed with people whose lives he'd touched. Tom was there. So were dozens of other WQED workers who'd been on strike 20 years earlier. A reporter asked Tom, "What will you remember most about Fred Rogers?" Tom didn't hesitate. September 15, 1983. The day he walked toward the picket line and I thought he was going to cross it. But he didn't. He stood with us. That's when I realized, this man isn't performing. This isn't an act. He really believes what he says. And he's willing to sacrifice everything to live by it. That's who Fred Rogers was. Not just on television. In real life. And that's why we loved him.